before I tell you what she did, let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone walk into a room like the rules simply did not apply to them? I've been sitting on this bench for almost 20 years, and I can read a person the moment they step through that door. I don't need to know their background or their bank account. I watch how they move. I listen to the tone they use when they think no one important is watching them. I notice whether they respect the space they're in or whether they treat it like an inconvenience. Most people who come to my courtroom are nervous. They should be. It matters here. The law matters here. The truth matters here. But every once in a while, someone walks in and the air itself changes. You can feel it. That morning was one of those days. I had been up since 5, same as always. I like the quiet before the courthouse opens. I go through my files with fresh eyes, no distractions, no phone, no people yet. I read the case summaries carefully. I make notes about what doesn't add up. I think about what I need to listen for. Most judges go through these files like they're checking boxes. I go through them like I'm trying to see what's hidden. There's always something hidden. Either the facts are incomplete, or someone is lying, or both people are telling a truth that doesn't match the other person's truth. My job is to figure out which is which. I dressed in my black robe the way I always do, not for drama, for authority. People take the law seriously when they can see that you do. I walked into the courtroom about 30 minutes before the first case. I looked at the courtroom itself, the way the light came through the windows, the way the seats were arranged. I sat at my bench and I felt the weight of it, same as I do every single day, 20 years, and I still feel the weight. That's how I know I'm doing it right. By 9 o'clock, the courtroom was starting to fill. I had 5 cases that morning, and this one was the second on the docket. The file was thin, which was interesting. Usually, when a case is this small, the facts are simple. Someone owes money. Someone broke an agreement. Someone damaged something and didn't want to pay for it. But this file was thin in a way that felt deliberate, like someone had made sure there wasn't much written down. The case itself was straightforward enough. The plaintiff was a woman named Margaret Chen. She owned a catering business, a small one, maybe 8 people working for her. The defendant had hired her for an event about 6 months earlier. A private party. Margaret showed up with her team, she did her job, and the food was good. But the defendant decided after the party that the food wasn't worth what she had paid for it. She called her bank and put a stop payment on the check. Margaret tried to work it out. The defendant ignored her calls. Margaret sued. It was not a complicated case. Either the food was what Margaret promised, or it wasn't. Either the defendant had a legitimate reason not to pay, or she didn't. Either they could work this out, or the law would decide. I should tell you something about Margaret before she ever walked into my courtroom. I had read the file before I even thought about calling the case. I saw her name on the paperwork. I saw her business listed as sole proprietor. I saw that this was her 3rd time taking someone to court for non-payment. The first 2 times she had one. That told me Margaret was not someone who took shortcuts. She was not someone who made deals that didn't hold up. She was someone who did her job and expected people to do the same. When Margaret came to the courtroom, you could feel the difference immediately. She was nervous, but not because she was afraid. She was nervous because she knew she was about to have to explain herself to a stranger, and she took that seriously. She sat in the plaintiff's seat with her hands on her purse. She was wearing her good clothes, not fancy clothes, but clean and careful. She had clearly taken time to prepare for this moment. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had to stand up in front of someone with power and tell them your side of a story? It's not easy, even when you're right. I asked Margaret to tell me what happened. She was quiet for a moment, the way people are when they're thinking about the best way to explain something true. Then she started talking. She told me about the phone call when the woman hired her. She had asked what kind of menu the defendant wanted. She had given 3 options, different price points, different menus. The defendant had chosen the middle option, the $60 per person menu. Margaret had confirmed it twice. She had even sent her a detailed breakdown of what that meant. Fresh seafood, catered salads, homemade desserts, professional service. Everything was written down. Margaret did the event on a Saturday in April. She brought 2 of her people with her. They arrived at the house at 4 o'clock. They set up the kitchen they had arranged. They cooked the food there, right in the defendant's kitchen, so it would be fresh. They plated everything. They served. They cleaned. The event went fine, Margaret told me. No one complained during the party. The defendant smiled when she said goodbye. She thanked Margaret for coming. That was Saturday. On Tuesday, Margaret sent an invoice. The check came back 2 weeks later with a note that said the food was not what had been promised. That was where the story got simple again. Either the food was what Margaret had promised or it wasn't. But here was the thing I noticed from listening to Margaret. She wasn't angry about the money. She was hurt about being made to feel like she had lied. She had done her job, she had done it well, and then someone she barely knew had called her work a disappointment and walked away. I had believed every word of this. Margaret sat back down and I looked at the file again. I looked at the stop payment paperwork. I looked at the timeline. Then I looked toward the courtroom doors because we were still waiting for the defendant to arrive. She arrived 15 minutes late. I had stopped my other cases to make time for this one, rearranged my morning. And she arrived 15 minutes late. That told me something about how she saw this place. The moment I saw her, I understood something about power that most people don't understand until they're sitting in my courtroom. Power is not what you have. Power is what you believe you have. This woman believed she had a lot of it. She was wearing sunglasses indoors, which meant the first thing she had to do was take them off. She looked like she had never had to do anything she didn't want to do in her life. Her hair was styled perfectly. Her clothes were expensive but casual in a way that costs thousands of dollars. She was carrying a phone that she checked. Even as she walked toward the defense table, she was chewing gum. I watched her sit down. I watched her lean back in her chair like this was going to be boring. I watched her look at Margaret the way you would look at a person who had tried to sell you something cheap and called it luxury. I already knew who I was dealing with. Do you think someone can know exactly what a person is made of just by watching how they sit down? Because I can, and I knew. I asked her name for the record. She said it was Victoria Ashford, just like that, like she thought I would recognize it. I asked her for her address. She gave me an address in the nicest part of the city. I asked her what her occupation was. She hesitated for a second, and then she said, "I don't have one. I'm semi-retired." She was probably 30 years old, maybe a little younger. Semi-retired at 30 is not a job. Semi-retired at 30 is a way of saying your family had money and you had never had to work for anything. I opened the file again. I looked at Victoria directly. I said, "I need you to explain to me why you stopped payment on this invoice." Victoria shifted in her chair. She smiled like this was going to be easy to get out of. She said, "The catering was not what was promised. The food was lukewarm. The desserts were not fresh. The whole thing felt like a rush job." I noticed something interesting right away. She had answered quickly, too quickly. It was a rehearsed answer. That meant she had prepared for this. That meant she had been ready to defend herself. That meant this wasn't about the food at all. This was about not wanting to pay. I leaned forward slightly. I said, "Walk me through the timeline. When did you first notice that the food was not what you expected?" Victoria shifted again. She said, "I noticed it during the service." I said, "But you didn't mention it to anyone during the service?" She said, "I didn't want to be rude." I let that answer sit there for a moment. I didn't say anything. I just looked at her. Sometimes silence tells you more than words ever can. This woman was not comfortable with silence. She added quickly, I shouldn't have had to point it out. The caterer should have known." There it was. There was the real answer. She shouldn't have had to point it out. She shouldn't have had to say anything. The world should have known that her standards were important and her satisfaction was the thing that mattered. Here's what I want you to understand. I had watched Margaret Chen sit in that chair and tell me the truth. I had watched Victoria Ashford sit in that chair and tell me what she thought I wanted to hear. But more than that, I had watched Victoria dismiss a person who had done her job well and expected to get paid for it. I had watched Victoria decide that her disappointment mattered more than her agreement. I said to Victoria, "I'm going to ask you one very specific question. Did you discuss the menu before the event?" Victoria's lawyer, who had been quiet up until this point, put his hand on her arm. He was trying to tell her to be careful. He already understood where this was going. Victoria said, "I don't remember exactly what was discussed." I said, "Let me refresh your memory. Miss Chen brought documentation. I have a copy of the email she sent. You confirming the $60 per person menu. I have your response email saying, 'Perfect. That sounds great. Did you send that email?'" Victoria looked at her lawyer. She looked back at me. She said, "Yes, but—" I didn't let her finish. I said, "Did you read the email before you sent the response?" She said, "Obviously I read it." I said, "And you agreed to it?" She said, "Yes, but I didn't expect," I said. "So you agreed to the menu in writing, and you received the menu you agreed to, but now you've decided that wasn't good enough. Is that correct?" Victoria's face was starting to change. I could see it. She was not used to someone pushing back. She was not used to her version of the story being the version that didn't hold up. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever seen someone realize very slowly that their power was not going to work on this particular person? Because I was watching that realization happen in real time. Victoria said, "I just think the whole experience was not worth what I paid for it." I said, "What was the experience worth to you?" She said, "I don't know, maybe $30 a person." I set the file down slowly. I took off my glasses. I looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. Then I said, "Here's what I'm hearing. You hired someone to provide a service. You agreed to a price. You received that service at that price. You were satisfied enough not to say anything while it was happening. But now you've decided to punish that person because you changed your mind about what you wanted to pay. That's not how the law works. That's not how respect works. That's not how any of this works." I could feel the room shift. I could feel every person in that courtroom suddenly paying very close attention. Victoria said, "I don't think you understand. I shouldn't have to." I said, "Stop. You're absolutely right. You shouldn't have to do a lot of things. You shouldn't have to keep your word. You shouldn't have to treat people fairly. You shouldn't have to admit when you've changed your mind. But here's the thing. You did all of those things anyway, because the law requires it. That's the whole point of the law. It exists because people don't naturally do the right thing." Victoria's face was red now. She was angry. People like Victoria are not used to being told no. They're used to money solving the problem. They're used to people backing down. They're used to their version of the story being the one that matters. She said, "This is ridiculous. I've never been treated like this. This court is a joke." I remember the moment those words came out of her mouth. I remember the sound of them in the courtroom. I remember the breath everyone in that room took at the same time. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get angry. I did something much more effective. I became very still. I looked at Victoria like I was seeing her clearly for the very first time. I said, "Let me tell you something. This court is not a joke. The law is not a joke. The right of people to be paid for their work is not a joke. The dignity of people who do honest work is not a joke, and you don't get to treat this place like it is." Victoria tried to say something. Her lawyer put his hand on her arm again, harder this time. He knew his client had just made a very serious mistake. I continued. I said, "What I'm looking at right now is someone who has never been told no, so she assumes the word doesn't apply to her. What I'm seeing is someone who thinks money puts her above the law. What I'm seeing is someone who hired a person to do a job, received that job, and now wants to punish that person because she's decided she doesn't feel like paying. And when I won't go along with it, she calls my courtroom a joke." I waited a moment. Then I said, "I've been doing this for 20 years. I've seen every version of this story. I've seen rich people try to bully their way out of agreements. I've seen poor people try to lie their way into money they didn't earn. I've seen everything, and you know what I've learned?" The law is the only thing that protects everyone equally. The law is the only place where your money doesn't talk. The law is the only place where what matters is what's true. I looked directly at Victoria. I said, and I don't accept disrespect in my courtroom, not from anyone. Victoria was quiet now. I could see something shifting in her. Not remorse, not yet, but fear. She was starting to understand that she had underestimated where she was. I said, "Tell me your father's name." Victoria's lawyer objected immediately. He said that was irrelevant, but I didn't care about the objection. I had already made my decision. I was asking the question to make a point. I said, "I'm asking you a question. What is your father's name?" Victoria said quietly, "Senator Ashford." I said, "Of course it is." I let that sit there for a moment. I said, "Your father is a senator. You've probably spent your whole life watching people defer to him, watching people assume that his power means something about you, watching people treat you carefully because of his position. But I want you to understand something very clearly right now. Your father's power is not in this room. Your money is not in this room. Your status is not in this room. What's in this room is the law, and the law doesn't care who your father is." I picked up the file again. I said, "This is my decision. Miss Chen provided exactly the service she promised. The documentation is clear. Your agreement was clear. You received what you paid for. The fact that you changed your mind about what you wanted to pay does not change what the law says you owe. You will pay the full invoice, plus court costs, plus interest from the date you stopped payment." I paused. Then I said, "And let me be very clear about something. The next time you stand in front of a judge, you're going to remember this moment. You're going to remember what happens when you disrespect the law. You're going to remember that there is one place in this country where you don't get to be above the rules." Victoria was staring at me. She looked like she couldn't believe what was happening. I continued, "You're going to pay Miss Chen what you owe her. You're going to do it by the date this court specifies, and you're going to do it understanding that if you ever decide the law is a joke again, there will be consequences that your father cannot protect you from." Victoria's lawyer stood up. He started to say something about appealing. I held up my hand. I said, "Your client called my courtroom a joke. That was her choice. That was her decision. Now she gets to live with it." I banged my gavel once. The case was over. Here's what I want you to understand about what happened after that moment. Victoria Ashford left the courtroom quietly. Her lawyer left behind her, probably already planning how to manage this situation with his client. But something else happened too. The other people waiting in my courtroom that day understood something very clearly. They understood that the law was going to be respected in this space. They understood that the law protects people who do honest work. They understood that power and privilege don't override the truth. Margaret Chen cried quietly at the plaintiff's table. Not because she had one, although she had. She cried because someone had finally acknowledged that she had been treated unfairly, and that treatment had mattered. That's what the law did for her. It said, "You were right. You did your job. You deserve to be paid." I found out later what happened to Victoria Ashford. She paid the full amount, but she paid it late, which meant she paid the additional interest. She also had to pay the court costs. In total, she paid almost more than twice what she had originally owed, just because she couldn't accept that she had to keep her word. I heard she became quieter after that. I heard she became more careful about making agreements. I don't know if that experience changed her, but I do know it changed something. Fear sometimes does that. It teaches you respect when nothing else will. But this case meant something bigger than just one woman learning a lesson. It meant something about how people treat each other when they don't think anyone is watching. It meant something about the difference between power and character. Victoria Ashford had power. She had money and status and connections, but standing in my courtroom, she didn't have character. She had made an agreement and decided it didn't apply to her. She had hired someone and decided she could treat them like they were beneath her standards. She had come to court and called the whole system a joke because she wasn't getting her way. That's not power. That's entitlement, and entitlement always looks different when the law is watching. I want to ask you something now. Do you think justice was served in this case? Do you think that's how you would have handled it, or would you have gone a different direction? I'm genuinely curious what you think, because this is the kind of case that says something about what we believe matters. Do we believe that power comes from money, or do we believe that power comes from integrity? Do we believe that the law is something that applies to everyone equally, or do we believe it's a negotiation for people who can afford good lawyers? I've been sitting on this bench long enough to know the answer. The law is the only thing that says you don't get to be above the rules just because you have money. The law is the only thing that says what matters is the truth, not who your father is. The law is the only thing that protects people like Margaret Chen. And that's why I still believe the law matters. That's why I still come to this courtroom every single day. That's why moments like this one stay with me, because I'm sitting in the one place where everyone is equal, where the rich can't bully their way past it, where the powerful have to answer for what they do, where a person who does honest work gets to be respected. If you believe in that, if you believe that nobody should be above the law, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Tell me what you think. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button and subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one. There are so many more people who walk into my courtroom thinking the law doesn't apply to them, and there are so many more moments where the truth wins anyway. I'll see you in the next one, and I hope you're ready, because the next story is about someone who thought she could fool a courtroom full of people, and I was waiting.